I'm Michelle Shoemate, and this is the Sustained Collaboration Podcast, sponsored by the Sustained Collaboration Network. I'm a professor, consultant, and researcher who's dedicated her career to studying and improving collaboration among social impact leaders. As a result of this work, I'm convinced that collaboration is an underutilized tool for making a bigger difference in communities. On this podcast, I'll be highlighting insights from recent case study research on nonprofit collaboration, available at sustainedcollab.org. On today's episode of the podcast, we're talking mergers. Mergers are a frequent strategic tool discussed in business schools, but are less talked about in the nonprofit sector and even less understood as a tool for increasing social impact. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking with a couple of leaders about the story of the Rebuilding Exchange and how they used a merger to help increase the social impact and scale of this nonprofit. What I appreciated the most about this conversation was the honest discussion about the intentionality it takes to integrate two cultures. I'm sure you're going to love it. All right. Thank you both for being here. I'm excited to talk to you about the merger that became the Rebuilding Exchange. And maybe we could just start by both of you introducing yourself. So, Lori, why don't you start first?
Thanks so much for having me, Michelle, and great to see you, Ina. I am Lori Alpern. My company is Open Door Advisors, a social impact consultancy, where we work with companies and organizations around the intersection and unification of strategy and people. And I've been a consultant to the Rebuilding Exchange and its predecessor, the Rebuilding Exchange, and the Evanston Rebuilding Warehouse since both of their startups.
And I'm Ina Gutierrez. I'm the executive director of the Rebuilding Exchange. I have been in the nonprofit sector for more than 20 years and love building strong organizations for big mission. The Rebuilding Exchange is a 501c3 nonprofit that reuses building materials, reduces construction waste, and trains and supports and connects folks to careers in the building trades. We are located in Chicago and have a location in Chicago and Evanston, which I can share more about.
Wonderful. Well, the way I got connected to both of you is through this report and this research that I did from the Sustained Collaboration Network. And as a part of that, I really was just inspired by the way that this merger came about and the thoughtful way that both of you approached it. And such a collaborative style, such open and kind of transparency and being so methodical about it. But I wonder if you could just take everybody back, maybe to that conversation you first had with the person who was the interim director at the Chicago Rebuilding Exchange while you were still leading what was known as the Evanston Rebuilding Warehouse. We'll have to sort that all out for the listeners. Talk to me about how this all got started. Why were you thinking about a potential merger? Why was this even on your radar?
Sure. So I think sometimes the best conversations are those that happen at happy hour. So the conversation at happy hour is between myself, and this was about a year into my tenure as the director of the Evanston Rebuilding Warehouse. And the Rebuilding Exchange had an interim executive director, Julian Paston. And we reached out to just connect. There aren't that many people in our world, and we are highly collaborative. And so I wanted to just get to know Julian more and understand what his role was at the Rebuilding Exchange and what they wanted. At the same time, within my first year, I was thrilled to be the executive director and had made a fair amount of organizational changes, but felt limited by a few things. First limiting factor was kind of just our impact in bigger, large scale issues like climate change and income inequity. You know, we had one location within a smallish town of Evanston, and while we did really good work, I kept feeling like this is a David and Goliath scenario where we're doing this great climate action work in Evanston and climate impacts all of us. So I was feeling limited by mission. I was feeling limited by efficiencies of scale. So thinking about, I think at the time we had 10 staff. So I was both the executive director and the finance director and the HR director and the retail director. And so you wear so many hats in small nonprofits and just feeling like not having enough resources, especially staff, at our disposal to make a meaningful impact. And then third, social enterprise is no joke. And so financial sustainability and balancing what we call the tension of mission and margin, running these businesses for good and training folks along the way, you live pretty close to the edge. It's a very scrappy grassroots existence. And I just kept feeling like if we could do business bigger, we could be more financially sustainable. So I was already struggling with those things and then met Julian and talked to Julian, and the Rebuilding Exchange had some leadership changes. And my question to him was like, what's your vision? What do you want to do while you're interim director? And everything he described was my organization and what I wanted to do with my organization. And so at the end of the conversation, we're both new. We don't have any baggage or politics. Like we don't know the history of any of this stuff. And my question was, why are we separate? So that was really the beginning of the partnership conversation. I don't know that I thought that we would merge at the beginning, and I'm sure Lori will speak more to her process, but I did know that this was an opportunity for two organizations that did so much with so little to be able to think about doing our work differently, and that being together could potentially be a solution for some of the challenges that I had personally in my role.
And, just to kind of pick up the story, at some point in time early on, you got connected to the Mission Sustainability Initiative, who provided some seed money, which allowed you to bring on Lori to try to help you manage this process a little bit. And so I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about Lori. You knew both of these organizations before you started this process. What was your ideas about how this process was going to unfold? What were some of the kind of structure that you brought to it?
So, as Ina pointed out, both organizations are relatively small, operating on the margin, and a consideration of a strategic alliance and merger is a serious and time-consuming business. So, first of all, it was really understanding, is it worth going through a process like this where the board would have to redirect their attention? Ina and Julian would as well have to invest significant amounts of time. Beyond just time and resources, it's reputation. Do we want to take the risk and begin this process not knowing where it might lead? And the answer across the board was a solid you bet, in service to one thing, and that was mission impact. If the opportunity of a merger or strategic alliance would result in both organizations having the ability to realize their mission impact goals in ways that they couldn't do alone, then it was a win-win. Now, of course, as Ina mentioned, the financial sustainability scenario had to be intact and in place and viable as well. But there was already a feeling of better together from the beginning. And it wasn't just the t-shirt or the coffee mug that said better together. It was, a very authentic openness and willingness to explore accelerated mission impact for both organizations. So I can start talking about, all right, so now that we know that, where do we start?
Well, I was just going to say, Anna, do you remember that kind of conversation at the beginning too? Did you remember everybody feeling like better together? Was it just you and Julian, or was there a broader board buy-in in that early days?
No, I feel like the board was very eager. Part of the process that Lori led us through was creating a committee of board members and staff from both organizations to come together. And I think when you're so mission aligned, and you have a similar value set of what we're trying to accomplish, personalities kind of gel. They come together. And I think what I really appreciated about the process was intentionality around building relationships and building community. That was baked in from the very beginning. And so the board universally were willing to explore all kinds of things. And this was one of those. I would say on the staff level, but they didn't know each other, I guess I would say. I don't think the board members knew each other. On the staff level, we knew each other already, because we had occasion to work together, and it's very common. I'm very much a let's not reinvent the wheel leader. Who else does this? Who does it better than we do? How can we learn from them? So we had already reached out in many aspects to Rebuilding Exchange and vice versa. We share customers. We would sometimes source materials to each other. So at the staff level, we came in very friendly, very excited about the conversation and the process.
And what we did, Ina mentioned the committee. So both organizations assembled a committee, which included both directors and several board members from each organization. And we realized that at this point, we needed to move beyond the good feelings and start collecting data and information that could inform whether a merger was an option that both boards and leadership teams wanted to consider. So our company structured a state of the organization report where we looked at 5 key areas of nonprofit impact and viability, specifically for employment social enterprises. And this was not an evaluation. It was a snapshot of both organizations side by side in these 5 areas. And the 5 areas included strategy, workforce development, talent and people, board governance, and financial sustainability. And we asked for and received full transparency of information from both organizations and did a side-by-side report of the state of the organizations in each one of these areas. And that helped inform and guide next steps, not just for the committee, but for the staff. And I can talk more about that as well.
And if I remember right, after that state of the organization report, there was a second kind of influx of money from the Mission Sustainability Initiative, and that was really to take it forward with the possibility of what this would look like to do a merger. Because after that report, everybody felt like that merger was a viable option here, and they were ready to move from the exploratory phase to a more preparatory phase for that work. So can you tell me a little bit about what that looked like? So after they'd kind of explored and looked at these 5 areas, what was next?
So it was recommended. So the report was not just for report's sake. It was based on the data, based on the process, what was the recommendation of how to move forward? And the recommendation was full merger, which was wholeheartedly approved by and excited for the joint committee and ultimately the staffs and the boards. So it was then, how do we do that? How do we do a merger and the legal and financial documents behind that? This was at the end of 2019. And so in early 2020, both organizations received pro bono legal counsel and had started to move forward in the process of at least the legal entity of what that would look like. And then COVID hit and it all fell apart for a while.
And Lori, in both phases, though, you had kind of thought about the collaboration piece of this and thinking about this as being a pretty participatory process. Can you tell me a little bit more about that in the second phase? Because I think there were 3 committees, if I remember correct, in that second phase. Why all these collaborative groups? Tell me a little bit more about the thought process there.
So the thought process is strategy is a tool, and what the true driver of impact is people. And if people are not involved, both staff and board, in the creation of strategy, people become disconnected, disenfranchised. And ultimately, while there may be fantastic work that transpires, it isn't in service to a united and unified level of impact. And, one of my favorite exercises, and favorite not just because it was fun for me, but it was seeing the staff do the heavy lifting, comparing side by side the missions of both organizations and understanding the what if, where are the similarities, where are the differences, and where are the possibilities to create positive change by coming together. So the staff really did the work. We helped facilitate a process that resulted in a joint strategic plan and action steps moving forward. it's not easy. I mean, coming together doesn't mean that 1 + 1, equals 2. And in reality, 1 + 1 is still 1. So where do you get the capacity? And this is really one of the biggest challenges and struggles. Where do you get the capacity to execute on the promise of the merger? How do you keep people trusting, engaged, motivated, incentivized to move forward? And I'm not sure we had all of those answers, but we did know that to the extent possible, bringing people together to create the strategy, to build the synergies themselves, as opposed to an outside firm saying, and here it is, go forth, it was such an important element in this process.
And if I might add, in this particular organization, and it was reflected in our strategic plan, teamwork is a core value. And it's because of the nature of the work that we do. So you can't move a refrigerator by yourself, or you shouldn't, right? You can't deconstruct a room by yourself. You can't, the way that we do workforce development, it's a model in which we create a village around every single participant. And so it's baked into the work we do every day. And so to not have a collaborative process where we're getting consistent and across the board feedback doesn't make sense in this context, because this organization in particular, it's part of our ethos. It's part of how we operate every day. The other thing I wanted to add is just in terms of our work with Lori, the benefit, I think you said, Lori, outsider. Lori's not an outsider to Rebuilding Exchange. There was no question when we received the implementation grant from Mission Sustainability Initiative that we wanted to work with Lori and her team again. Because I think there's such a value in having institutional memory and history, understanding the process that we're going through, having the relationship. I just think that's critical. And so in my work as an ED with consultants, I want to work with people that are highly competent and that I trust ultimately. And we were doing a scary thing. And so I just couldn't imagine doing a scary thing with a stranger.
Thank you. I mean, the process also gave us the opportunity. We do a lot of work in the social enterprise, employment social enterprise space, and it gave us the opportunity to bring tools like financial sustainability analysis, earned income analysis to the process. And what was so important is that there was no holding back by the leadership team or by the board. Having the ability to come in and see everything, see the open book, ultimately yields a better process and better outcomes for all. And that's when we know that this type of consulting is set up for success. It's a very, very complex business model on a lot of levels.
One of the things that you talked to me about was how essential the people piece of this was. And, we did a bunch of screening interviews with case studies we did not end up selecting. And one of the things that I heard overall from organizations who either did not merge at the end or who had buyer's remorse when they did merge was that they didn't manage the people piece very well. That they still felt like they had two very different organizations under the same umbrella, that there was a constant kind of tension there. And so one of the things that just struck me, because there was just a very contrasting story in what was going on with Rebuilding Exchange. So can you talk to me a little bit about how you thought about the people piece, particularly around the staff, and how you thought about including them in the process in terms of making selections about things and making choices? And then what have you done to kind of bring them together? Because that was one of the really big differences that I saw here.
Sure. I mean, and I would say that's one of the most challenging pieces. I mean, I could do an internet search and give you a checklist on how to merge, but you're not going to build a strong workplace culture on your checklist. You're not going to find, create intentional leadership opportunities and listen. And, you're just not going to find that on a checklist. And it should be there. If I could add a section, I would add a culture section. And so it was very important to us from the beginning to not only hear from our staff, but co-create what this thing could be. So that meant feedback on all kinds of structures, especially as we moved from one organization who's used to working out of one location to one organization that has 2 locations. And while it's only 12 miles apart between the two, it's a good amount of drive and the facilities feel different. The community is different. And so how do we move forward in incremental ways to make sure that we're honoring both locations and both communities and honoring all the work that folks did to get us to this point? I mean, a lot of what I said continuously in the first year of the merger is like, you all got us here. Now we just need to take the next step and decide how we're going to work together. And so I think the providing inclusive processes around like workforce development program modeling. How do we operate our stores? How do we create, now we're a larger staff. Guess what? We need more managers because people need better and more supportive supervision. So how are we building that in? And if we can internally promote people, even better, so really investing in the culture organization wide, but also investing in individual people that got us to where we were. So I think that was a big part of it. The other thing is, and one of the other values that came out of our strategic plan is just joy. And so we have to be intentional about community building and also celebrating the big and the small wins and just providing care and feeding people in many ways and feeding them not only physically, food is a big love language at Rebuilding Exchange, but giving space and time for just connection and sharing. And so actually today we catered soul food to celebrate Black History Month. And we have 2 locations. And so we did the exact same thing. We ate soul food in Evanston yesterday. We ate soul food in Chicago today. And all it was a conversation about Black leaders in construction. And who are the leaders and how do we honor that? And so that takes time and energy and money. And it is absolutely critical to have those moments. So we've had to be very consistent in where and how we select feedback from folks and when can people make decisions themselves. We've been consistent about and strategic about staff structure, ensuring that people have, the other nice thing from the merger is everyone kind of has a little team. So you're not just like the one person who works alone, everyone's part of a little team. So there's like mini communities that are being built. And then just social community building baked in from the very beginning. So it is, but there's no checklist. There's no checklist on how to do this. No. And I think it's just, and I would say in our context, in my 22 years of experience, I've never had as diverse of a staff as this one. And not just what you would expect in terms of racial and gender diversity, but education, socioeconomic status, roles and responsibilities. I mean, I sit at the same table as a person who sits behind a wheel of a truck and delivers equipment. And it's beautiful. But this beautiful mix of experiences, I think, enriches everything. And in order for that enrichment to go into the organization and do all the wonderful impact things we want to do, we just have to take the time and the resources for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what I'm hearing and taking away from what Ina said is intentionality. And that is the difference. All the activities and points that Ina just described, as she said, they take time, resources, money, and they require first and foremost intentionality. Way too often we go into organizations and we start talking about people and the executive director, the CEO says, well, people are our greatest asset. And when I ask, well, okay, how does that show up? What do you mean? Well, people are valued here. And it's not enough anymore to say that. And people deserve more. They need to know how they are valued within the organization. They need to feel a sense of belonging and they need to belong. And they need to know that their organization is fair and just in all that it does. And everything that Ina described are the details behind those principles. And it doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean there aren't difficult moments and there can be distrust. In a merger, people want to know, rightly so, well, what does this mean for me? What does it mean for me? And they deserve answers. And I never really saw Ina shy away. And I think we need and Julian as well. I think we need to understand and recognize that the labor and emotional labor of a merger is on top of the day-to-day work. So people really have to build that in to their plans when they're considering a merger, so that they don't feel shortchanged, that they feel supported, they feel to the extent possible they have the resources they need.
And you can't emphasize the role of the executive leadership in setting culture and working on it, because I can't be everywhere, but I can set a parameter around why we're doing this, how we're doing this, and other people, other leadership need to demonstrate similar methods. So we have an open door policy, for example. Like, if the door's open, I don't care what role you're in. You want to come talk to me, and that's also for the leadership team. It's a place where we have even more responsibility, and it takes even more effort. So even the soul food example, like, I've had 2 very heavy lunches and I could probably write one more grant application instead of going to the second one, because we already celebrated Black History Month, but it's not the right thing to do. It's not, I have to sit down. I have to take 30 minutes. I have to talk to whoever shows up. And that's the cost. That's the cost. But the reward is 100% worth it. And Lori's value around belonging, 100% is people need to feel like they belong, that we're all imperfect and we're all doing our best and we're all doing it together.
Which reminds me, we did, I think it was in 2021, just when COVID restrictions were being lifted, we had an all-staff in-person retreat, and we discussed, it was very much a working session. It was partially outdoors, partially indoors, masks, and of course, as Ina said, food and so on. But it was the first time all people from both sites were coming together. And we were very intentional about putting people in the lead, not the consultants. Nobody, wants to hear from us, but really having it, we created a framework that could then be adapted and adopted by the team to lead each other.
And it's not an easy thing to do in employment social enterprise. We had to close our businesses.
Yeah.
Like, every time we get together, we have to close our stores. So it is, again, it's easy to put off. It's hard to do. We're decentralized. We're open to the public, like all the things. But at least twice a year, we close. We have to close because it's just that important.
Love that. As I think about the reasons at the very beginning, you described, Ina, for why you want to do this. Part of the reason was sustainability, was growth, was being able to do things that were bigger. Can you talk just briefly about, what's been the result of coming together and merging? And particularly, what have you seen as the most significant wins of the merger?
Sure. So our merger officially went through March 1st of 2021. So we were delayed from COVID, but picked it back up and went through the process. And I think there have been some it is a challenging thing to do. I will say the first year in particular, you're really building, what we ended up building is what I thought was a new organization. So it wasn't 2 halves, like Lori said. It's not 1 + 1 = 2. It's 1 + 1 = 1. And the 1, we didn't know all the components of what it would be. So we did all the organizational development pieces, which have put us on a much stronger infrastructure trajectory. Strategic planning, data infrastructure, accounting, all of those things. The real impact, though, is, of course, the mission. So we have found efficiencies of scale in diverting building materials. And so our impact at this moment is more than 3.3 million pounds diverted from a landfill every year. And that's not a one store did this, one store did that, and now we combine. The number is higher. And the number is higher because we have coordinated efforts in the operations. We are being more efficient in pickups because we have 2 locations, like all the operational pieces that are feeding the impact. On the workforce development side, which is tied to a lot of what I do, which is fundraising, in the fall of 2021, the state of Illinois released 2 notice of funding opportunities to support building trades workforce development in pre-apprenticeship and in our transitional employment program. We had never received a direct contract with the state. ever. And frankly, I don't know that I would have done it on our own, except that we felt like we had the capacity to accomplish what we wanted to do with the program, which is to get more people into family sustaining careers in the trades, the financial capacity to be able to manage it, and the administrative capacity to be compliant. And so we applied to two, having no idea if that would, make sense for us. And by January of 2022, we got both of them, which added about $700,000 to our budget and increased the number of participants we served 200% in our first year. Is it a pain? Of course. Of course, the administrative stuff is more complicated, all of that. And we're serving 100 people a year. We served 100 people a year in 2022 and 2023, and we're serving 110 this year. It is that ability. And what some of the feedback we got was, you have the budget side and you could demonstrate capacity. And also you have two locations, and in locations and communities where other people are not doing this work. And so we want your locations as a way to be able to do that. So the programmatic side has been just unbelievable. And also in the greater community, a lot of when I first started at the Evanston Rebuilding Warehouse, one of the things I heard most was like, we're the best kept secret in Evanston. And I was like, do we want to be the best kept secret in Evanston? I don't think so, But we were small. We were less than 10 years old. We were less than $1 million budget, less than 10 staff. We are no longer a kept secret in Evanston or Chicago. We get requests all the time. Our social media is more than 60,000 people. When we talk about informing and educating the community on climate change and income inequity, we're it. We're it in our building materials reuse space and our construction space. So there's no question that having the ability, the locations, the talent of the staff has helped everything grow mission, strengthen revenue, and really, really bring the whole team together. So it's been really, really hard. It's one of the hardest things I've done in my career. And every year when I look back at what we've done and we, celebrate all of our wins, just totally worth it.
Yeah, and everybody can now hear exactly why you're one of the 20 collaborations in this report, because that's exactly what I think the funders who are doing sustained collaboration across the country, including the Mission Sustainability Initiative, are thinking about. It's about how do you help not just organizations become more financially sustainable, and that's good and important, but it's also the mission impact that you can have when you come up a little bit, right? And for your case, it was come up a level. One of the things I hear sometimes in some of the cases is, we crossed that magic $5 million mark or that $1 million mark, and all of a sudden people are paying attention to us. They never paid attention to us before, right? All of those things become more possible when you consider the ways that you could do this through integration, through partnerships, through different types of alliances. So I'm thrilled that you're part of it. As I kind of last thoughts, I'd love to hear both of you just kind of offer some advice, imagining that some of our listeners are listening to you and they're thinking, maybe this could be a possibility for our organization. Maybe that there's something here for us. What advice would you give to another organizational leader who's considering a merger? And maybe we'll start with Ina and then we'll end with Lori.
So I think the biggest advice that I would give is just don't start from scratch. Talk to people. And the Mission Sustainability Initiative actually helped connect us to a number of people. I just wanted to understand from other practitioners, how did it work? If you could do it over again, what would you do differently? Where did you need external wonderful consultant resources? And what did you feel like you could do on your own? And so I would start from just talking to some folks who have done it. And I'm always happy to talk to people because I do think it's a really effective strategy for impact and scale. The second thing I would say is we've talked a lot about people. Just bring your people in at every step along the way. It will take longer than you think. It will be more expensive than you think. And that's all okay. But just prepare that it is, if you are going to explore a merger, acquisition, or a strategic partnership, it should be one of your organizational priorities. It's not the thing that you do on the side. It's one of the top 5 things that you're going to do this year. And that's also okay. But make it very core and central to what you need to do. And third, I would just say, have some fun with it as much as is possible. Bring your folks together, think big, dream big. A lot of the stuff I talked about was very operational in nature. And how we were able to come together. But now, even in this moment, like we're thinking much, much bigger than we were before. And I don't know if it'll happen for us. And I don't know that I don't know how big we're supposed to be. But those opportunities and that visioning is only possible when you have enough under you that you feel like, what are we going to do next? Those would be my three things.
I guess let me just talk about it from two perspectives. One is the high level, and I will just say two words: practical optimism. Practical optimism. And the second is around the why of mission impact, and get a sense of what that really means. And things that might look like challenges or obstacles are actually might be opportunities. I think one of the most exciting benefits with employment social enterprises is their ability to take the dynamic nature of the enterprise and leverage that into employment, leadership, economic, sustainability opportunities for people, so that every person that walks in the door of the Rebuilding Exchange as a participant in the workforce development program understands the potential and the promise, and that staff understand that every person that walks in the door has expectations. And those two things come together so that something that was created so many years ago now, for example, career pathway can positively exploit the growth of the enterprise in career pathways and economic self-sufficiency opportunities for people. And that is part of their mission impact. So whatever you do as an organization, whatever type of nonprofit, having a deep understanding of what is really possible in terms of your mission impact moving forward will help with that fuel for practical optimism.
Love that. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast and for being part of the research that became part of this report. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Michelle.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Sustained Collaboration Podcast. The Sustained Collaboration Podcast is a joint venture between the Sustained Collaboration Network and the Network for Nonprofit and Social Impact at Northwestern University. You can learn more about the Sustained Collaboration Network and download the research referenced in this podcast at sustainedcollab.org.